Somewhere in a suburban backyard, a gardener spends an entire Saturday morning breaking new ground. The fork sinks into compacted turf, lifts a heavy clod, flips it over. Again and again. By midday, the plot has been turned completely. Dark soil exposed to sunlight for the first time in years, grass and weeds buried beneath the surface. The gardener stands back, satisfied. The bed looks clean, ready, full of promise. 2 weeks later, the same plot erupts in weeds, not scattered patches. A dense carpet of seedlings thicker than anything that grew there before the digging began. Chickweed, groundsel, fat hen, annual meadow grass. Species that were barely visible when the ground was still covered in turf suddenly appear by the thousand. The gardener pulls them by hand, hoes them weekly, mulches between rows. But they return faster than they can be removed. Within a month, the bed that required the most effort to create has become the most difficult to manage. This is not an isolated failure. It happens in gardens across every climate and soil type. The pattern repeats so consistently that most gardeners assume it is simply the cost of starting a new bed. You dig, you fight weeds for a season or two, and eventually the ground settles. But the weed explosion is not random, and it is not inevitable. It is the direct result of what digging does to soil. Because soil is not an inert material waiting to be shaped by human effort. It is a living system. A single teaspoon of healthy garden soil contains more microorganisms than there are people on Earth. Bacteria, fungi, nematodes, protozoa, springtails, mites, and earthworms exist in densities almost impossible to imagine. These organisms do not simply live in the soil, they create it. Fungi extend microscopic filaments called hyphae through the ground, forming networks that can stretch for miles within a single cubic meter of earth. These fungal highways transport water, nutrients, and chemical signals between plants and across distances that roots could never reach alone. The most important of these fungi are mycorrhizae, species that colonize plant roots and exchange nutrients for sugars produced during photosynthesis. Research published in 2024 found that mycorrhizal networks store approximately 36% of global carbon emissions annually, locking carbon into stable underground structures that can persist for decades. But these networks are fragile. When soil is turned, fungal filaments are physically severed. The network collapses. Bacteria that thrive in dark, oxygen-limited environments suddenly find themselves exposed to ultraviolet light and desiccating air, conditions most cannot survive. Earthworms retreat deeper into the ground or die outright if caught in turned soil during dry weather. The biological architecture that took years to develop is destroyed in an afternoon. And then there are the seeds. Buried in every garden soil is a seed bank, thousands of dormant weed seeds waiting for the conditions that trigger germination. Many of these seeds can remain viable for decades, lying inches below the surface in a state of suspended animation. What keeps them dormant is darkness. Studies on weed seed ecology show that burial depth is one of the strongest inhibitors of germination. Seeds buried more than 2 inches below the surface rarely germinate, even if they remain viable for years. But when soil is turned, those buried seeds are brought to the surface. Suddenly exposed to light, temperature fluctuations, and oxygen, they interpret these signals as an opportunity. Within days, they begin to sprout. The gardener who dug the bed did not create the weed problem. The weeds were already there. Digging simply woke them up. At the same time, the biological systems that would normally suppress weed growth, fungal networks that occupy space, bacterial communities that compete for nutrients, earthworms that incorporate organic matter and create stable soil structure, have all been disrupted. The result is predictable. Maximum effort produces maximum problems. The bed becomes harder to manage, not easier. And the gardener concludes that this is simply how gardening works. But it is not. Because in natural ecosystems, soil is almost never disturbed, yet it remains fertile, stable, and remarkably free of the weed explosions that plague cultivated ground. Forest floors are never dug. Meadows are never turned. Yet both support dense productive plant communities year after year without collapsing into chaos. The difference is not the soil itself. It is what happens, or does not happen, to the biological systems within it. The question of how to grow food without destroying soil structure is not new. For most of agricultural history, farmers worked within the constraints of available tools and animal power, which meant that some fields were cultivated intensively while others were left undisturbed for years. But during the 20th century, mechanization made deep tillage both easier and more common, and the assumption that soil must be turned before planting became nearly universal in commercial agriculture. By the 1980s, however, a small number of growers in different parts of the world began questioning whether all that digging was actually necessary. One of the most influential figures in this rediscovery was Charles Dowding, a British gardener who began experimenting with undisturbed soil management in the early 1980s on a small plot in Somerset. Dowding had trained in conventional horticulture and understood the standard methods, but he was also curious about what would happen if beds were never dug at all. Instead of turning the soil each season, he began building fertility from the surface by adding compost in thin layers and allowing earthworms and soil organisms to incorporate it naturally over time. The results were not immediate, but they were consistent. Weed pressure dropped significantly after the first year because the seed bank remained buried and undisturbed. Soil structure improved as fungal networks and earthworm channels developed without interruption. Crops grew well, and in many cases they grew better than in adjacent beds that had been dug and amended using conventional methods. Over the following decades, Dowding refined the approach through continuous observation and record-keeping, eventually developing a system that could produce high yields on the same beds year after year without any tillage whatsoever. His work was not widely known outside specialist gardening circles until the early 2000s, when he began publishing books and sharing detailed records of his harvests, which consistently demonstrated that undisturbed beds could outperform tilled ground in both productivity and ease of management. What made Dowding's approach particularly useful was that it was not based on ideology or abstract soil science, but on direct comparison. He maintained side-by-side trials where one bed was dug annually and another was left undisturbed, with both receiving identical compost applications and growing the same crops. The undisturbed beds required less weeding, less watering, and less intervention overall while producing comparable or greater yields. By 2010, the no-dig method had begun attracting attention from market gardeners and small-scale farmers who were looking for ways to reduce labor and improve soil health without sacrificing productivity. Research institutions also began studying the biological mechanisms behind the method, confirming what Dowding and others had observed empirically for years. Mycorrhizal colonization rates were significantly higher in undisturbed soils, earthworm populations increased over time, and soil carbon levels remained stable or improved rather than declining as they often do under repeated tillage. The method worked not because it added something extraordinary to the soil, but because it stopped removing what was already there. The biological systems that regulate fertility, structure, and pest suppression were allowed to function without constant disruption, and once those systems stabilized, the garden required far less effort to maintain. But understanding why no-dig works is only part of the story. The more practical question is how to organize a garden so that it produces food continuously throughout the year without depleting the soil or creating bottlenecks in planting and harvesting. That question leads directly to the 5-bed system. The number 5 is not arbitrary. It emerges from the intersection of crop biology, soil fertility cycles, and the practical realities of year-round food production. Most vegetable crops belong to a small number of botanical families, and plants within the same family tend to share similar nutrient requirements, pest vulnerabilities, and root structures. Brassicas, such as cabbage, kale, and broccoli, are heavy nitrogen feeders that attract specific pests like cabbage white butterflies and flea beetles. Legumes such as peas and beans fix atmospheric nitrogen through symbiotic bacteria in their root nodules, enriching the soil for crops that follow. Root vegetables like carrots and parsnips require deep, loose soil and are vulnerable to carrot root fly. Alliums including onions, garlic, and leeks suppress certain soil pathogens and can be interplanted with fast-growing salads. Potatoes are heavy feeders that produce dense foliage, shading out weeds and leaving the soil relatively clean after harvest. Traditional crop rotation systems recommend moving each plant family to a different bed each year, with a minimum cycle of 3 to 5 years before returning the same family to the same location. This rotation reduces pest and disease buildup, balances nutrient extraction, and allows soil biology to recover between demanding crops. A 5-bed system allows each major crop family to occupy its own bed while rotating through the garden on a predictable schedule. One bed can be dedicated to soil recovery through green manure or cover crops, ensuring that fertility is rebuilt rather than merely maintained. The system is large enough to provide diversity and rotation, but small enough to manage without machinery or excessive labor. Each bed measures approximately 1.2 meters wide and 4 to 6 meters long, a size that allows access from both sides without stepping on the growing area. 5 beds of this dimension can feed a household of 2 to 4 people year-round if managed with succession planting and careful timing. The first bed in the rotation is dedicated to brassicas. This family includes kale, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, and other leafy or heading crops that form the backbone of winter and spring harvests in temperate climates. Brassicas are heavy nitrogen feeders, meaning they extract significant quantities of nitrogen from the soil to build their dense leaf structures and large root systems. In a well-designed rotation, the brassica bed follows immediately after the legume bed because legumes leave behind nitrogen-rich residues in the form of root nodules and decomposing plant material. This natural fertility transfer reduces or eliminates the need for additional nitrogen inputs during the brassica growing season. Brassicas are also among the most cold-hardy vegetables available to gardeners. Research from Johnny's Selected Seeds and Oregon State University confirms that kale, collards, and Brussels sprouts can tolerate temperatures well below freezing, often surviving down to minus 10 degrees Celsius or lower when properly hardened off. This cold tolerance makes brassicas ideal for extending the harvest season deep into winter, providing fresh greens when most other crops have finished. The brassica bed is typically planted in mid to late summer, allowing young plants to establish before cold weather arrives. By late autumn, the bed is producing heavily, and harvests can continue through winter and into early spring before the plants bolt as temperatures rise. Once the brassicas are cleared in late spring, the bed is prepared for the next crop family in the rotation. The second bed is reserved for root vegetables. Carrots, parsnips, beetroot, turnips, and Swedes all belong to different botanical families, but they share similar growing requirements and are grouped together for practical reasons. Root crops require loose, stone-free soil that allows their taproots to penetrate deeply without forking or distortion. They are generally light feeders compared to brassicas, meaning they do not require heavily enriched soil and can follow brassicas in the rotation without additional compost applications. One of the key advantages of root vegetables is their storage potential. Carrots and parsnips can remain in the ground through winter in many climates, with cold temperatures actually improving their flavor as starches convert to sugars. In colder regions, roots can be lifted in late autumn and stored in boxes of moist sand or sawdust in a cool, dark location where they will keep for several months. This storage capacity makes root crops essential for year-round food security, bridging the gap between the end of winter harvests and the arrival of spring greens. The root bed is typically sown in mid to late spring, with succession sowings continuing into early summer for crops like beetroot and turnips that mature quickly. Parsnips and main crop carrots are sown once in spring and left to mature slowly over the summer, reaching full size by autumn. The third bed is dedicated to legumes. Peas, broad beans, French beans, and runner beans all belong to the Fabaceae family and share a remarkable biological capability that makes them central to any rotation system. Legumes form symbiotic relationships with rhizobia bacteria that colonize their root systems, creating visible nodules where atmospheric nitrogen is converted into ammonia through a process called biological nitrogen fixation. Research from New Mexico State University and Chapman University confirms that this symbiotic relationship can fix between 50 and 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, depending on the legume species and growing conditions. When legume crops are cleared at the end of the season, their roots are left in the ground to decompose, releasing this fixed nitrogen into the soil where it becomes available to subsequent crops. This is why brassicas, which are heavy nitrogen feeders, are planted immediately after legumes in the rotation cycle. The legume bed provides a natural fertility boost without requiring external inputs. Legumes are also highly productive in terms of fresh weight harvested per square meter. Peas and beans produce continuously over several weeks when picked regularly, and many varieties are suitable for freezing or drying, which extends their usefulness beyond the fresh harvest period. Broad beans are typically sown in late autumn or early spring, depending on climate, and harvested in early summer. Peas follow a similar schedule, while French beans and runner beans are frost-sensitive and must be sown after the last frost date in late spring. The fourth bed combines alliums with fast-growing salad crops and other quick-maturing vegetables. Onions, garlic, leeks, and shallots all belong to the allium family and share certain characteristics that make them useful in rotation systems. Alliums have relatively shallow root systems and are light feeders, meaning they do not deplete soil fertility as aggressively as brassicas or potatoes. They also produce sulfur compounds that have been shown to suppress certain soil-borne pathogens and pests, which can benefit crops planted in the same bed the following year. Garlic and onions are typically planted in autumn and harvested in midsummer, leaving the bed available for a second crop. Leeks are planted in spring and harvested progressively through autumn and winter. The spaces between allium rows can be interplanted with fast-growing crops such as lettuce, radishes, spinach, and rocket, which mature in 4 to 8 weeks and can be harvested multiple times before the alliums require the full bed space. This interplanting strategy maximizes productivity per square meter and ensures that no bed sits empty during the growing season. Salad crops are particularly valuable in early spring and late autumn when few other vegetables are available fresh, and their shallow roots do not compete significantly with the deeper-rooted alliums. The fifth bed is dedicated to potatoes, followed by green manure. Potatoes are heavy feeders that produce large quantities of foliage, which shades the soil surface and suppresses weed growth during the growing season. They are typically planted in mid-spring and harvested in late summer or early autumn, depending on whether early mid-season or main crop varieties are grown. Potatoes leave the soil relatively clean and loose after harvest, making the bed ideal for sowing a green manure crop immediately afterward. Green manures, also called cover crops, are plants grown specifically to improve soil fertility and structure rather than for harvest. Common green manure species include winter rye, field beans, phacelia, and mustard, each offering different benefits. Winter rye produces deep roots that break up compacted soil and prevent nutrient leaching during winter rains. Field beans fix nitrogen and add organic matter when cut down in spring. Phacelia attracts beneficial insects and produces large quantities of biomass that can be incorporated into the soil or left as surface mulch. Research from the University of Vermont and Missouri Extension confirms that green manures feed soil organisms, increase organic matter content, and improve soil structure by adding root biomass and protecting the surface from erosion and compaction. The green manure is typically sown in early autumn after the potatoes are lifted, allowed to grow through winter, and then cut down in early spring before it sets seed. The cut material is left on the soil surface as mulch, where it decomposes and feeds the next crop in the rotation. This fifth bed completes the cycle, and the following year each crop family moves to the next bed in sequence. Brassicas move to where roots were grown. Roots move to where legumes were grown. Legumes move to where alliums were grown. Alliums move to where potatoes were grown, and potatoes move to where brassicas were grown. The rotation ensures that no crop family returns to the same bed for 5 years, which is long enough to break most pest and disease cycles while maintaining balanced soil fertility. Each bed receives a thin layer of compost annually, typically applied in late winter or early spring, but the compost is never dug in. It is simply spread across the surface and left for earthworms and soil organisms to incorporate naturally over time. This surface application maintains the no-dig principle while continuously building organic matter and feeding the biological systems that regulate soil health. The 5-bed rotation system can be established on any reasonably flat ground, but most gardeners face the same starting point: compacted lawn or weedy pasture that has never been cultivated. The conventional approach would be to strip the turf, dig the beds, and remove as much grass and root material as possible before planting. But this approach triggers exactly the problems described earlier: disrupted soil biology, activated weed seed banks, and months of intensive weeding before the beds stabilize. The no-dig alternative uses a method called sheet mulching, which suppresses existing vegetation without disturbing the soil structure beneath. The process is straightforward and requires only two materials: cardboard and compost. In late winter or early spring, the area where beds will be established is mown as short as possible, and any thick vegetation is cut back to ground level. Cardboard is then laid directly over the grass or weeds, overlapping each sheet by at least 15 centimeters to prevent light from reaching the vegetation below. Research from Oregon State University Extension confirms that cardboard works by denying light to photosynthetic plants, which causes them to die back over a period of several weeks without producing viable seed. The cardboard itself is biodegradable and will decompose within 6 to 12 months, leaving no residue that interferes with plant growth. Once the cardboard layer is in place, compost is spread on top to a depth of approximately 5 to 10 centimeters. This compost layer provides an immediate growing medium for transplants or direct sown seeds, while the cardboard beneath continues suppressing the original vegetation. Within weeks, earthworms begin moving upward through the cardboard, incorporating organic matter from both the compost above and the decomposing grass below. Fungal networks colonize the new compost layer and gradually extend downward into the existing soil as the cardboard breaks down. By the end of the first growing season, the cardboard has largely disappeared, and the bed has become a continuous soil profile with no visible boundary between the added compost and the original ground. The grass and weeds that once occupied the site have decomposed in place, contributing their nutrients and organic matter to the developing bed rather than being removed as waste. This method allows beds to be established without digging, without herbicides, and without the weed explosion that typically follows soil disturbance. The first crops can be planted immediately after the compost is applied, and the bed improves continuously over subsequent seasons as organic matter accumulates and soil biology develops. The 5-bed system is designed not only to maintain soil health but to provide food continuously throughout the year, eliminating the feast and famine cycle that affects many vegetable gardens. This continuity depends on understanding which crops produce during which seasons and how to stagger planting so that harvests overlap rather than arriving all at once. In early spring, the garden begins producing overwintered crops that were planted the previous autumn. Broad beans sown in late October or November reach maturity in April and May, providing the first substantial harvest of the year. Overwintered onions and garlic continue growing as temperatures rise and early sowings of peas begin flowering. Kale, purple sprouting broccoli, and other brassicas that stood through winter produce heavily during this period, often yielding more in spring than they did during the colder months. By late spring, the first succession of salad crops is ready, along with radishes, spinach, and early turnips sown in March. Summer brings the peak production period when beans, courgettes, tomatoes, and summer brassicas such as calabrese all mature simultaneously. Root crops sown in spring are thinned progressively, with young carrots and beetroots harvested for fresh use, while main crop varieties continue growing. Potatoes are lifted in late summer, and the space they occupied is immediately sown with green manure to protect the soil through autumn and winter. As temperatures drop in autumn, the garden shifts toward storage crops and cold, hardy vegetables. Main crop carrots, parsnips, and beetroots reach full size and can either be stored or left in the ground under mulch. Leeks, winter cabbage, and Brussels sprouts begin producing and will continue through the coldest months. Salad crops sown in late summer provide fresh greens until hard frosts arrive, and in milder climates or under simple protection such as cloches or low tunnels, they can be harvested throughout winter. By late winter, the cycle begins again as overwintered broad beans and early brassicas resume growth, and the first sowings of peas and salads are made under cover or in sheltered beds. This continuous rotation of planting, growth, and harvest ensures that no month passes without something ready to eat, and no bed sits idle for long periods. The reason the 5-bed no-dig system becomes easier to manage over time rather than harder lies in what happens beneath the surface when soil is left undisturbed. In conventional gardening, each season begins with the same tasks: digging, weeding, amending, and fighting to restore order to beds that have collapsed back into compaction and weed growth during winter. In a no-dig system, the opposite occurs. Each year, the soil structure improves, weed pressure decreases, and the biological systems that regulate fertility and pest suppression become more robust. Earthworms are among the first indicators of this change. Research from Kansas State University Extension and the Soil Association confirms that earthworm populations increase significantly in undisturbed soils, often doubling or tripling within 2 to 3 years of adopting no-dig methods. Earthworms create vertical channels as they move through the soil, improving drainage and aeration far more effectively than mechanical tillage. Their castings are rich in nutrients and beneficial microorganisms, and they continuously incorporate surface organic matter into deeper soil layers without any human intervention. Charles Darwin famously calculated that earthworms could move 10 tons of soil per acre per year, effectively plowing the ground from below while leaving its structure intact. Fungal networks develop more extensively in undisturbed soil because their delicate hyphal threads are not repeatedly severed by digging. Mycorrhizal fungi colonize plant roots and extend far beyond the root zone, accessing nutrients and water that roots alone could never reach. These fungi also produce glomalin, a sticky protein that binds soil particles together into stable aggregates, creating the crumbly texture that gardeners associate with healthy soil. As organic matter accumulates on the surface and decomposes gradually through microbial activity, the soil becomes darker, more moisture-retentive, and more resistant to compaction. The weed seed bank gradually depletes as seeds near the surface germinate and are removed, while deeper seeds remain buried and dormant. Within 3 to 5 years, a well-managed no-dig bed requires a fraction of the weeding effort that a tilled bed demands. And crops grow more vigorously with less input because the soil ecosystem is functioning as an integrated system rather than a disrupted collection of particles. The gardener who spent an entire Saturday turning soil and then faced an explosion of weeds 2 weeks later was not failing at gardening. They were succeeding at something else entirely: activating a seed bank, severing fungal networks, and displacing earthworms, all in the name of creating order. The effort was real, the intention was sound, but the method worked against the systems that regulate soil health rather than with them. The 5-bed no-dig rotation does not eliminate work, but it redirects effort toward cooperation rather than control. Instead of fighting to suppress weeds that digging brought to the surface, the gardener prevents their emergence by leaving the seed bank undisturbed. Instead of rebuilding soil structure each season through mechanical tillage, the gardener allows earthworms and fungi to construct it continuously from below. Instead of applying fertilizers to replace nutrients lost through disruption and leaching, the gardener builds fertility through rotation, compost, and the nitrogen-fixing capacity of legumes. The result is not a garden that requires less care, but a garden that requires different care. Care that aligns with biological processes rather than overriding them. Over time, the beds become darker, more stable, and more productive, not because anything extraordinary was added, but because the systems that were always present were allowed to function without interruption. The forest floor was never dug, yet it remains fertile year after year. The 5-bed system simply applies that same principle to the production of food, proving that abundance does not require conquest. It requires patience, observation, and the willingness to let soil do what it has always done when left undisturbed. And sometimes, the most productive gardens are the ones where the fork stays in the shed